intro. Greetings, folks. Now we're going to do the second part of Joseph Stalin, and I think we got to the 1930s, but I don't believe that Jonathan had covered the purges or the 5-year plans. The sort of the industrialization, which was always a theme in Russia over the last 200 to 300 years. This idea of Russia catching up with the West, and probably since Peter the Great.
Yes. So yeah, since Peter the Great, basically Russia historically has been a lot behind certain Western European countries. So since Peter the Great, there was this thing of Ben was saying of Russia catching up, and there was also the issue of communism itself, because communism and Marxism was predicated on the idea of an advanced industrial society, and which would create a big working class, which would, I could hear something. I think it may be.
Yeah, Witzia, not to point fingers, but could you do like me and switch off your mic when you're not talking?
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
There we go.
Right. So within Marxism, the idea is that Marxists are kind of characterized as anti-capitalist, and that is true to a point, but technically they do think capitalism is better than the previous forms that came before it. So they think it's better than feudalism, for example, and classicalism. They see the idea of Marxism is that you begin with primitive communism in tribal societies, and where everything is shared equally. And then you move on to the classical era, where you see the first real divisions, which is between masters and slaves in agrarian societies. And then after that, you get feudalism, where you get the next division is between lords and serfs. And then after feudalism, you get capitalism, where you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the upper middle class and the working classes mostly. And supposedly, at the end of capitalism, the working classes will rise up and take control of all the means of production, so all the industry, all the manufacturing, all the resources, and that will usher in an era of socialism, which will eventually lead to advanced communism, where everything is shared. That is the theory. Now,
I'll just say, just to interrupt, part of the problem is that with Marxism is the labor theory of value, because I could spend 10 years writing a novel, put loads of labor into it, but it might end up being a piece of trash. Whereas and they would just look at the amount of effort put into the product in terms of judging its value. But you can't run a society. It doesn't work well like that. You need the market with price signals to show what the value is of something. And this relates to something that von Mises came up with in maybe the 1920s. He wrote an essay called The Economic Calculation Problem about why the Soviet Union would fail. And that is because when you set prices, there is no way to gauge demand by fluctuating prices. And so, for example, the fact that people are prepared to pay so much for Apple devices is a signal that people really want them. And it's also a signal to other manufacturers to maybe do something that is similar, because there's profit to be made in that area. So these price signals are very important. Then something else that Friedrich Hayek came up with, who was a sort of who was taught by von Mises, Ludwig von Mises, is that he said that because knowledge is diffuse, and it's all diffused amongst everyone's brains, that it's difficult for a centralized state to have all of that information when making these decisions. And I remember when I was, I still am interested in military technology, but I would like read these, and I was specifically interested in the Russian military-industrial complex, about how Gosplan would plan the economy and various things like that. So that's just a little bit on the sort of the counter view on the economics, and that is the problem with price signals. There's not the price signals. And oh yeah, so Jonathan, are you going to get into the collectivization that Stalin got into in the 1930s of agriculture?
I was about to, yes. Okay. Right. So I'll just add to the point. Marx based a lot of his theories on. This was Marx's theories, kind of, but Marx based a lot of his theories on the economic orthodoxy of his day, on people like a guy called Ricardo, for example. And after he was writing his famous book Capital, a lot of the theories he based it on were debunked, and that was part of the reason why he never really finished the next 2 volumes of Capital. There were other reasons, but that was one of them. Nonetheless, when Marx died, his writings went to his friend Friedrich Engels, who left it to the German Socialist Party, who took a look at it and thought, firstly, there's way too much Marxist stuff. Secondly, a lot of the stuff is kind of contradictory. Thirdly, some of it's kind of controversial and a bit offensive even. So they kind of edited and controlled the output of Marxist literature. And there's a whole story behind that, but basically this led to a lot of internal debate over what Marx meant and what he didn't mean. What Marx meant and what he didn't mean, and so on, in different theories. So that's stuff I said about how you have primitive communism, and then classical, and then feudal, and then capitalism and socialism and stuff. That's kind of in Marx, but really it was codified by Lenin. So Leninism. So there's a lot of debate over what Marx precisely meant, but point is, Stalin was a Leninist. He followed Vladimir Lenin, and he saw Marxism and he saw Russia through the lens of Leninism. Their issue with Russia is that Russia was not ready for a socialist revolution according to their interpretation of Marx, because it was not an advanced capitalist society. The expectation was that Germany and Britain would become the first countries to undergo a proper socialist or communist revolution. What Lenin was kind of hoping was that his revolution would spark revolution in Germany and Britain, and it did in fact spark revolution in Germany, especially when World War I ended. But those revolutions did not work out, so now they've got a bit of a problem. Communism does not really work. Even if to the extent that communism does work, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work unless you have the whole world being communist, or certainly all the advanced industrial nations being communist, working together. That's the only way it could even begin to work.
I have an interpolation because I've read the Communist Manifesto, and he writes about something very interesting in it towards the end, and that is where he writes about socialism being used by the provisional government. And this is what I think he thought at the time, was that he thought that the provisional government and that socialism would be untenable, and that the aim was to destroy class consciousness. And then when he described the state of communism as opposed to socialism, he said something like, where the benefit of one is the benefit of the individual is the benefit of one, and there would be sort of mutual exchange, where it's almost like the populace had got to an enlightened level where they would mutually exchange amongst themselves without a state, and it actually writes about the state withering away.
Yes. The point is that the point for Marx was that socialism and is when the workers take control of the government essentially and the means of production, and then they fight off the reactionary forces of capitalism and the old order and stuff. And then once that's all dealt with, the state eventually withers away. This was because let's put them in contrast with the anarchists who expected that you could just abolish the state and that's it. Marx thought you had to have this take control of the state. Ben, your mic's still on. Your mic.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just feeling really today. Yes, Marx. Now, he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, which happened to be the year of a series of revolutions. It came out just
I'll just say it was also before people starting to learn things about genetics and Darwin, and that's very important because of the assumptions in dialectical materialism that it's basically nurture that is responsible for human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And also now a lot of this was because, and when I was very left wing, you have a natural tendency against sort of genetic concepts because it was used so much in terms of, oh, he's got breeding, where they would talk about that. And that concept of breeding is offensive to left-wing people. And so it's sort of like it all melds together with eugenics and stuff like that. And so there's a natural tendency for left-wing people to be against that. Again, they hate that word breeding because that would always be used as sort of like the authenticating discourse for why these certain people were in power. Now, there's a couple of things I want to mention about economics. So I can't remember when Bastiat came out with his fallacy of the broken window, which is the story. Have you heard of the fallacy of the broken window, Witzia? Right, I know. So I blame your university. You studied economics, but they didn't tell you about it. That's left-wing bias. So Frederick Bastiat, a libertarian Frenchman, can you believe it? And so he wrote about, and this is important because it's about seen versus unseen effects. And it's the story of the baker. And the baker has his window smashed by a vandal. And then a crowd gathers outside to discuss what's happened. And they say, oh, that's a bad thing. Someone says, hang on a minute, though, because that window has been smashed, that's created some work for the glazier. And so that's an example of a seen effect, that the window has been smashed and it's created work for the glazier. We can see that job. We can see that spender. The baker comes out and says, yeah, you can see that, but you know what I was going to do? I was going to buy a new suit, but now I've got to pay for this new window. And so that is an unseen effect that is gone. You can't see that. It's spending that would have happened, but wasn't. So that's an unseen effect. And so the lesson from seen versus unseen effects is, for example, with government spending, you can see where the money is spent, but you can't see where that money would have been spent if it hadn't have been taken away in taxation or taken away in inflation. Because when it's taken away in inflation and the cost of everything goes up, people spend more of their income on rent and food and fuel. And so again, seen versus unseen effects. So that's one thing. I think that was a part of Bastiat's short book called The Law. And then the other thing was, this is an older concept, and this relates to the collectivization, tragedy of the commons. And Jonathan, you might know about this. Peter Schiff said that one of the first colonies they started in the United States, they had a sort of socialism amongst the farmers, and they almost starved because they had sort of common land. Have you sort of read about that?
Not much.
Not much, but something vaguely. Enough to know I'm not making it up, because
I've heard.
right. So that's just a couple of economic things with the collectivization, the industrialized. So I remember this like getting towards that, and they tried something similar in China, like this making of, but it was always a Russian thing of catching up with the West, and also militarily as well. Because they saw how industrialized warfare had become, and so they needed to. And I also think that, yes, I remember now because I watched one of those alternate histories, that sort of industrialization was also a part of. I've forgotten his name. Trotsky. That's it. I was going to say crazy hair, glasses. Trotsky's thinking was also about industrialization.
Yes, that's the one I sponsored, actually. That video. That alternate history video is one I sponsored.
Yeah. Like, what would happen if Stalin wasn't around and replaced by Trotsky? Very good, Jonathan.
And then he goes and remakes it.
Did he mention you at the end on the remake?
No. But my main issue was actually that it was more or less the same video. Just a collaboration with this cynical historian, another guy. Anyway, that's a totally different rant. And we're ready to get back on Stalin because that's been 25 minutes without Stalin. So the point is that under Marxist theory, they want an advanced industrial nation, and also under Russian problem, they want an advanced industrial nation because that's how they compete with the West. So when Stalin took over, there was this struggle with him and Trotsky. Trotsky wanted to focus on exporting the revolution abroad. Stalin thought that that time had come and gone, the opportunity had passed, we should focus on socialism in one country. Socialism in one country was not meant to be like permanent. It was meant, at least in theory, it was meant to be like just to consolidate their power and position, and then focus on world revolution later on somewhere down the line. But long story short, this led to Stalin instigating the 5-year plans to industrialize the Russian economy as rapidly as possible, which had a huge human death toll. And then after that, this is where he installed collectivization. Collectivization was actually Trotsky's idea, and Stalin initially opposed it, and siding with the new economic policy guys, which was a kind of limited capitalism. But after Trotsky was gone, he turned on the new economic policy guys and then turned to collectivization, as Stalin was wont to do. So once he got rid of one enemy, he turned on the other, and then he ended up running the show. And this part of him became dictator. So the collectivization thing led to more, because it was essentially the state controlling everything directly. That led to a lot of power for Stalin, because Stalin was now basically the top guy in the Soviet Union. He'd managed to excel his rivals or have them kicked out of the Politburo. And then in 1933, some guy called Adolf Hitler comes to power. And Stalin's got a bit more involvement in that than people realize. But in 1934, Hitler instigates a purge of the Nazi party called the Night of the Long Knives, where he gets rid of some enemies within his party ranks and some other enemies. And Stalin reportedly Stalin said, that guy Hitler is great, that's how you deal with your enemies. And this may have inspired what came next, which was the Great Terror in Russia, where Stalin purges hundreds of thousands of people. Now, just to be, In the last couple of decades, there was access to a lot of Russian. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was access to a lot of Russian documents from the time that weren't available before. And these kind of caused historians to revise their numbers down a bit. So in the past, there were ridiculously high numbers for how many people died under Stalin, some of which would have probably caused the annihilation of Russia itself. So now there's kind of lower numbers. And also, they'll notice that although Stalin might have purged a lot of people, purging didn't always mean killing. Sometimes it just meant being fired. Sometimes it meant being sent to the Gulag. And some people who were purged were actually reinstated, and just with better training. So mostly purged the army and the party, but he also purged different industries. And there was a culture of tattling on like your friends and family and your colleagues and stuff.
Yeah, so I think Korolev was in a Siberian gulag, and he came back, and that contributed to his ill health. When he was the head of the Soviet cosmic program. So there's something else. So wasn't there a thing with where Stalin was exporting grain from Ukraine, and there was some starvation in Ukraine because he wanted some foreign currency for something. So deliberately exporting food even when the Soviet Union was short of food in order to get currency, maybe to import some technology.
Maybe.
There was I think there was a famine in Ukraine that was sort of deliberately caused. And this was one of the issues that Khrushchev had against Stalin, Khrushchev being Ukrainian.
Well, there's many people who would debate that, some of who are Stalinists, actually. But nonetheless, yes, there was a big fire under Stalin, and the worst of it was in the Ukraine. That was during the 20s. In the 30s, it's the Great Terror. He's purging all his enemies. And this is followed by World War II. World War II happens partly because Stalin makes a deal with Hitler to not fight each other. That's partly because he doesn't trust the West, and the West doesn't seem to take an alliance with Stalin too seriously from Stalin's point of view. But after signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is named for the foreign ministers of Germany and Russia, that's when the Nazis invade Poland. And after the Nazis invade Poland, the Russians are invading Finland, and the Russians also invade Eastern Poland. And so by 1940, there's basically a big line of Germany controlling Western, especially in 1940. 1940s, Germany sweeps over Western Europe and other parts, but Russia is controlling most of Eastern Europe. And because the Germans are kind of mismanaging their economy, they're running short of oil and they're very dependent on Russian oil. And this is one of the main reasons why Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Now, there's also ideological reasons and racist reasons as well. So,
forced interruption here. So, Tick has done a video on oil, and basically, Germany had the Ortaki Policy because Hitler believed in the shrinking markets fallacy. He didn't know it was a fallacy, but it was a fallacy. And this is the idea that if Germany kept exporting technology, other nations would just copy it, and then Germany would be screwed. But that has not proven to be the case, because after World War II, they continued to export technology. And I think it's the time preference, because that has thrown me off completely. I don't know where I was. I mentioned, yes. So, yes, because of the autarky policy, Germany didn't want to trade. And they actually they did a thing with, and they actually calculated how much oil they would need, and they only got about half the oil reserve that they actually wanted before the war started, because at that time about 70% of the world's oil was from the United States. Then there was the Soviet Union, and then a little bit from Venezuela, and there was like little just started in the Middle East, in the British possessions in the Middle East, but there was problems with transfer. And so, and in Russia it was oil from the Caucasus. They hadn't done the Siberian oil yet. And so there's the Maikop and Grozny in the Caucasus, which become big factors in Stalingrad. But what Tick was saying was that Hitler was told that Germany would run out of oil in September 1941, and a huge impetus was for Germany invading the Soviet Union was to get the oil in the south. And Hitler kept on telling his generals when he wanted to go right to the south, they wanted to go to Moscow, and the compromise was, all right then, we'll go, but Hitler wanted the main thrust to go to the south to get the food in Ukraine, because Germany was also short on food, and to get the oil from the Caucasus. Also, you had weird things happen in occupied France, like you would have milk going bad because they couldn't afford to fuel the lorries to transport the milk. So Germany was really knackered for oil. And during the war from about 1942 onwards, you get more of the synthetic oil production from coal, but it's highly inefficient process and it takes a long time to wind up. So now in the 19th century, Germany was well positioned when everything was sort of like coal powered, because Germany had a huge amount of coal. And so that's why Germany was able to catch up with Britain, that also had a huge amount of coal in the 19th century. So, yes. And also, as Jonathan says, yes, people have said Hitler was obsessed by Stalingrad. No, he was obsessed by race. And secondarily, oil. And he said that my generals have no understanding of the economic factors of war. So yeah, so bad economics. That's what. So yeah, and a lot of stuff in Mein Kampf. He just lays it out there exactly what he thinks and what he wants to do. Oh yes, and I'll just mention the plan was they just wanted to. They mentioned that line. Right, I don't know what's happening. So I've sort of said my bit. I'll be quiet. Over to you, Jonathan. And what's you?
Yeah. Well, here. Right. So yeah, after basically there's a war. Germany invades Russia. Goes badly at first, but the Russians manage to fight back, especially with help from the Americans and the British. And America gets involved, and then Hitler declares war in America. And then Hitler ends up fighting a war on two fronts, and his economic mismanagement and everything else helps the whole thing go to hell.
I've got another interpolation. So Lend-Lease was a huge factor. So and it didn't really get going until 1942. And basically, Tick thinks that's the channel Tick History stands for the Imperator Knight. He thinks that the Soviet Union would have starved without Lend-Lease in 1943 because so much of Russian agriculture was coming from the European part of Russia, especially Ukraine. He thinks that without Lend-Lease, and he mentions, and he went over some communications between the Soviet Union and the United States, where the Soviet Union was wanting the United States to open a second front. And they said, okay, but we're going to have to stop Lend-Lease. And they said, no, we need Lend-Lease. So Lend-Lease was extremely important to the Soviet Union. Just in something like trucks, in the United States would be able to send hundreds of thousands of trucks and radios. There was so much that was sent. And just logistically, all of those trucks helped so much. And on the other side, Germany never had enough truck. And a lot of their battles in the Soviet Union were determined by how far away they were from the railway lines, just because of the way they could only transport the army so far from the railway lines. So, yeah, I'll be quiet now.
Okay, do your best. So yes, eventually everything goes wrong for Hitler, and of course he loses and ends up committing suicide, and Stalin ends up in control of most of Eastern Europe and some Central Europe, and he maybe there's some tension between Stalin and the West now, and then you get the Iron Curtain, beginning of the Cold War. Soviet spies managing to get their hands on the bomb, like nuclear weapons. Stalin may or may not be getting ready for another purge with the so-called doctor spot. But he dies in 1953. He may or may not have been poisoned. He probably wasn't poisoned, but it's always a possibility. And then his lackey Beria and some other guys end up taking power, but then Beria is turned on by the other Soviet leaders because Beria's a terrible person and they don't like him and they're afraid of him as well. And this leads to Nikita Khrushchev becoming the new Soviet premier. And then Khrushchev gives his infamous speech where he says Stalin was not a good person. We've all been under this terrible personality cult where he's been glorified. But really, he was a bad man, did terrible things, and we're still Soviet, we're still communist, we're still going to aim for the great socialist world, but we're going to be nicer about it and going to have a bit more freedom and liberty. And the rest is history. So yeah, that's the short version of Stalin.
Are you going to get into his personality now, Jonathan?
If we have time, yes. If we want.
Well, we've got about 27 minutes.
Okay. So there's debate of what Stalin's personality was. Part of the problem is that when Trotsky was in exile, Trotsky wrote about the Soviet Union and the history of it and a lot of criticism of it, and he painted Stalin as this kind of dull, boring, bureaucratic type who's like kind of above average intelligence, but he didn't see Stalin as the main guy. He didn't see Stalin as like an intellectual or anything. He actually thought that a guy called Nikolai Bukharin was his main rival because he was a more respected intellectual and he was the leader of the so-called right opposition, which advocated sort of limited capitalism. And it really took Trotsky a good few years to realize how dangerous Stalin really was. Trotsky in exile actually approved of some of the things that Stalin was doing, which cost him some support. There's this image that Trotsky was like the moderate democratic communist, but really he was just he was less of a dictator than Stalin was, but he was still a brutal dictator, and he would have been a brutal dictator in his own way. But the point is that Trotsky's writings kind of color a lot of people's image of Stalin as this not necessarily dumb, but not especially smart and not especially sophisticated person, and that's not really true. Like again, all the documents from these fall of the Soviet Union came out, and there's a lot of revising of what Stalin was like. There was also of course, the other view where Soviet propaganda portrayed Stalin as a brilliant visionary genius and infallible communist leader. What historians eventually came to accept and realize that Stalin, well, he obviously wasn't as, fantastic as his own propaganda made him out to be. He was still much smarter and more interesting than Trotsky gave him credit, and perhaps even more so than Trotsky even realized.
I'll just say something for Wizio, and so. If you study Kersey, he talks about 4 different intellects, and the intellect that Stalin was very good at. So probably with Trotsky, you got Trotsky as an intellectual. So this is the world of abstractions, whereas Stalin's intellect was logistical, and even the Allies said that Stalin was very good at logistics, and so this is the thing that the difference between someone who's intelligent and someone who's an intellectual. So, for example, my own father got an IQ of 150 plus, was in Mensa, but he's not an intellectual. So there's a difference there between intelligence and intellectual. So,
well,
Jonathan.
Well, I'm trying to say that Stalin was more of an intellectual than he
okay.
commonly recognized as, because Stalin, as I said in the first video, Stalin was a voracious reader. I've actually seen him be called the best read Russian leader since Catherine the Great ever, including Lenin. Maybe he may have read more than Lenin did. This is the sort of person who read a book every single day. He read, as I said before, The Origin of Species as a teenager. And as I said, he mugged people for books. So really voracious reader. He was not necessarily known as a theory guy. That was where part of this comes along. Like Trotsky and Lenin were more involved in the theory side of Marxism. Stalin had some of that, but it wasn't as prominent. He was focused a bit more on practical stuff and pragmatic stuff. He was also known. He was a poet, and he wrote a lot of poetry when he was younger, when he got published. He excelled at school. He spoke several languages. Like he could read and write Latin and Greek, and Russian, of course, was his second language. He was from Georgia. He may have known some German, I think. He thought that Lenin did not have the same sense of power that he did, and he said this when he was quite young as well, so he was the sort of guy who felt that he had a natural sense for power and power relations, knowing when to speak and when not to speak, when to watch stuff, how to read a room, how to walk into a room and control things. If we were going into Enneagram, he's normally what's called the Type 8 personality, or he's thought to be the Type 8 personality, which is kind of good at that sort of thing. Not to paint up Type 8 as Stalin, mind. Most are not like Stalin, but
for Witzy, I'll say that the 8 is the control freak. Kind of.
Well, not necessarily. Like other types of control freaks.
Well, okay, obsessed with power and control.
They have a sense of 8s have a really strong sense of their own power, and they like to be in control of their own lives. And they can be vengeful in the sense that they want to get even with people who they feel have wronged them, so on.
Do you think that's what made him less emotionally connected to people, such as like his son that then he gave off to the Nazis and like his wife?
All they gave his son to the Nazis is that his son was captured by the Nazis, and he'd installed this policy before that anyone captured by the Nazis there'll be no negotiations, no releases. So,
yeah, but surely if it's his own son, like he would have some emotional attachment to it.
That has been kind of debated by lots of different people. Some people say it's really heartless of him. In a way, it was very ruthless. At the same time, it would have looked pretty bad if he installs this policy saying that there'll be no negotiation for any officer, and then suddenly starts making exceptions for his own family. So it could be a sort of ruthless pragmatism there. His relationship with his kids was not great, admittedly, and this was his son from his first marriage, and there was resentment over how that boy's mother died. So, but that's not the best example of his ruthlessness. He is Joseph Stalin, though. There's a million examples of Stalin being ruthless. There's a story that when his first wife died, allegedly he said, "With my wife's death, all traces of human feeling have died with her." That may not be a real story. It's like apparently his friend who was at the funeral said that he said that. But it's hard to say. There's a lot of quotes that are attributed to Stalin that might not have been true. But yeah, the whole point is that he's someone who really wants to be in control of his own life, and also there's a protective quality to the Type 8 as well. And if they're healthy, they're protective. If they're less healthy, they're like protective in the sense of like protection rackets or protection of a abuser and stuff. But yeah, the real issue is there's a lot of debates over whether Stalin's Myers-Briggs type is, because there's been different things offered. So David Kearsey, who Ben mentioned, is saying that he's an ESTJ, which is a common for Type 8s actually. Like Type 8s are often ESTJs, but you can make arguments for like ENTJ and INTJ perhaps even. Yeah, the main thing is he's the way he thought is a matter of some debate, because as I was saying, a lot of the image of Stalin is based on, all the typings of Stalin are based on the image that was painted by Trotsky, or the image that was painted by Stalin himself, and not so much on what Stalin was really like, which is presumably what prompted these videos that we're making right now. Although I've spent a lot of it recounting Stalin's life rather than his personality. So
yeah, I'll show for the audience. I'll put up a sort of a parody version of ESTJ, but it still gets the essential sort of picture across. I've just got to. There it is. So that, in case I get in trouble from Dario Nardi, because he publishes this book. This is from his book, The 16 Personality Types, Descriptions for Self-Discovery. And so, although this is a parody over here, there's a lot of truthfulness to it, and this is more serious. And this gets towards the intellect, the logistical intellect. Theme is supervising with an eye to the traditions and regulations of the group, responsible, hardworking, and efficient, interested in ensuring that standards are met, resources conserved, and consequences delivered. He certainly did that. Talents lie in bringing order, structure, and completion. Want to keep order so the organization, group, family, or culture will be preserved. Thrived on organizing and following through with commitments and teaching others how to be successful. So,
sorry to interrupt, but do you think that's what kind of led his 5-year plan of how to like evolve Russia and everything? Was this type of his personality?
Well, all the Soviet leaders were plotting something like that. The real issue is how ruthless Stalin implemented it. But 5-year plans were not exclusive to Joseph Stalin. Like the Nazis had a 5-year plan, and the Maoists had a 5-year plan. It was quite common amongst.
I'll just say, to add something, Jonathan said he was a big reader. Stalin was a big reader of reports of what he was controlling, the state. He read a lot of reports about the state and very much into the details of it, where somebody like Hitler was far more hands-off and not into those logistical details. In fact, Hitler's more of an idealist. It was a weird, warped idealism, but Hitler was very much an idealist with warped ideas. Stalin was very, very cynical about human nature, and like people act best when they're frightened, like, and that sort of thing. Like, to really scare people motivates them. That's how he thought he'd motivate the Soviet public. And there was a thing where there's a story that Hitler met Franco, the leader of Spain. And I think Franco was more like Stalin in terms of logistical. And Franco was telling Hitler about, he needs more grain. He was telling him about economic things. And Hitler was saying that I'd never wants to talk to Franco again. He was so boring. And I think it's those logistical details. And so Franco's a very interesting dictator to cover, and sort of like how sort of clever he was at sort of maneuvering himself. But yeah, maybe Franco in future. So yeah, that logistical intellect of just being very interested in caring a lot about the details of procedures and standard operating procedures, and really being sort of that detail-oriented CEO. Hitler was far more hands-off and actually wanted the different agencies to be sort of competing with each other. And
Well, that was partly because the reason Hitler did that was partly because of ideology, because he had the social Darwinist theory that competition brings out the best in people. It obviously didn't there.
But yeah, sorry about that. I was just about to say that there is that, and Tick has shown that although there is that social Darwinist thing in Nazism, in terms of actions, the Nazi Party spent a heck of a lot of money on social welfare programs. There's a book that came out called Hitler's Beneficiaries. Now, I think part of that was a cynicism from Hitler that he didn't want the same thing to happen that happened in World War One, where he wrote about the stab in the back, didn't he, Jonathan? Where he thought that the German army was stabbed in the back by the population, and so he wanted to keep the population happy by sort of bribing them with.
Well, stabbed in the back by socialists and communists and trade union strikers who were manipulated by the Jews, of course.
Hitler's thoughts. Is that so he would call capitalism Jewish international finance. Yeah. So he thought that Bolshevism was a Jewish conspiracy and that capitalism was also a Jewish conspiracy. So it's all weird.
There was a logic to it if you follow trace the ideas.
I've seen Tick's videos.
Point is, Hitler, part of his reason was social Darwinism, another part was his thoughts. He might have felt that if he was above it and everyone else was fighting for his favor, then he was more in control. He was cynical in that sense. But of course, it was also part of his personality. He found details boring. So that kind of Hitler was pretty lazy outside of certain particular areas. But yeah, and comparing him to Stalin is a bit interesting. Stalin, as I said, he had a bit more of a romantic streak when he was younger, and he didn't just read report, he read all kinds of things, like fiction and non-fiction, and he was also an editor. He edited the Bolshevik newspaper, and he enjoyed the company of novelists and artists and stuff when he was in power, as long as they were censored to a point. And he had that Hitler and Stalin both had this tendency to doodle things. Make doodles. So I think some of Stalin's doodles were kind of sinister, like people being hung, but nonetheless.
So this is about core temperament, which is, so this would be, you're going to remember, we're looking for deeply unhealthy versions of these. So Hitler's would be like this, but a really unhealthy version of this. Because Jonathan typed him as ENFJ.
I will say, I think we spent a lot of time on recounting Stalin's history and not enough on the personality things. I would expect more debate in that, but that's
responsible. Yeah, like, so we could discuss how this becomes warped in Stalin, where stability, security, and community. So he probably thought that, from his point of view, like, what's best for Russia is like best for the Soviet Union if he is in control. And also there's that long tradition of all of those czars who were total despots, who had total control. And so within the grand sweep of Russian history, Stalin might have just seen himself as just like another czar.
Well, yeah, they couldn't say that because he was a communist.
Yeah, but you know what I mean, like the strong man kind of leader. And then that stability. Trust hierarchy and authority, especially when they are the hierarchy and authority.
Yeah, the interesting thing with calling Stalin SJ is that he's not at all the stereotype in terms of being. He's not really traditional. He's a revolutionary. He's trying to overthrow the government and society. He is taking in things from his own particular childhood, because Georgia, and the place he grew up, was a kind of a rough and tumble place. And the people he hung out with were like ruffians and then violent revolutionaries and so on. But that's partly true of all the other Bolsheviks.
I'll just say for Witzia that Khrushchev is more like this, artisan, much more about freedom, and like he spent like 5 months away from the Soviet Union before like Brezhnev he was out enjoying himself, and I think that Khrushchev was a true believer, but and Kersey typed him as ESFP, so a collaborator, artisan. And so again, the freedom to act more, and he literally was an artisan as well, Khrushchev. He was a welder. So there we go. And then the next slide is about interaction style. So in charge for Stalin, which goes along with the 8. All 8s are going to have an in-charge interaction style. Focused on results, often taking action quickly.
Well, I wouldn't say always have an in-charge interaction style, but even if they're not one of those, and they'll have it strong. Like if it's not their main style, it'll be their second style, shall we say?
Yeah, that's a little debate that Jonathan and I are in, where it depends how you look at Enneagram as a type or a fixation, and as to which people can have the fixation or be like, and how the people who've written the profiles and have of other things got in there, but that's a different debate. Right, so yeah, basically the in-charge interaction style, which Hitler also had, but Khrushchev more like this, because he was. I think he wrote in his book that when he was deposed, and he said it might have been like building his own legacy, when he said that if Stalin were in charge, there would be nothing but like a red spot on the carpet, and you would have been killed.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that this is like peaceful, it's like that is my contribution, and so it was much more. So, do you know anything about maybe Khrushchev been a bit more like this more cooperative kind of. I think Khrushchev wanted more, like he didn't want to be a dictator. He wanted the Politburo to run the Soviet Union. He didn't want to be the one solely. He didn't want to be a dictator like Stalin. He really believed in it. So more of this interaction style of this cooperative, collaborator interaction style. But that's just for contrast between Khrushchev and Stalin.
So yeah, that's almost time. I don't have much.
Right. Don't know what else there is to say there. So maybe what we can do is go over to Witzia for specific questions for Jonathan, maybe on Stalin. Maybe because you said you wrote the book that his daughter wrote.
Read the book. Read the book.
Yeah.
Wrote.
What did I say? Did I say right?
Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah, no, I read it a while ago, and it just showed that like even his own daughter didn't trust him and saw him as a monster. So I was just wondering what kind of part of his personality showed that. Because obviously he was capable of loving his own child because he loved her a lot, but then she fled to America and disowned all of communism basically.
Yeah, so he was quite good with. He liked his kids when they were kids. That's how we should say it. Like he was the sort of guy who would be quite friendly with the kids and friendly with other people's kids. How are the same goal actually? This in Stalin's case, he was more likely to include kids he would later have killed or sent to the Gulag, either as adults or as kids still. But yes, as the kids grew a bit older, he became more controlling of them, and there was a more tense relationship between some of them. And there's also the story where his daughter was with in the house of Beria, who I mentioned earlier, and Beria, apart from being a mass murderer who's the head of secret police and stuff, he was also known to be like a rapist and a pedophile. So Stalin, when he heard that, he phoned her and said, "Get the hell out of that house. Do not be with that man." So there was still some concern there. But yeah, with Svetlana, she was growing distant as she got older. Some of it was just like normal, like rebellious teenager stuff with a controlling father. But in this case, your father is the dictator of the Soviet Union. And there was, after Stalin died, there was also like attempts to court his kids and get them on the side of the leadership to lend themselves some more legitimacy. But yeah, I think Svetlana for a time was kind of a true believer with her father, but the reason she fled wasn't so much because of Stalin, but because she didn't want to get caught up in all the power games and be a pawn of all these Soviet leaders who wanted to manipulate her for their own ends. And being exposed more to Western stuff made her question the ideology of the Soviet Union, its controlling nature, and her own very controlled life, and reflect on a bit more. I'm sure she'd already started to resent her father a bit more, and she remembered things like when she was younger, being on the train with her dad and driving through the countryside and seeing the famine and all the dying people and asking about it, and Stalin just closed the curtains and didn't talk about it. But yeah, so with Svetlana, the relationship was more, and like I said, in some ways just a typical rebellious teenager, but all those issues being amplified by the fact that your father is Stalin and then you end up being a pawn of his lackeys, and that's what leads to her fleeing to the West. Oh, pardon me.
Well, this was all really interesting, honestly. It's really like interesting to find your guys' opinion about everything and like find out what his kind of personality was as well, to kind of see why he did what he did. But yeah, I'm gonna have to go.
Right then. So what I'll do is I'll end recorder. Just gonna